Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our event today. And we just want to welcome everybody to this very important film screening, 1948, Creation and Catastrophe, a documentary about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I wanted to start by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Sabrina Ali Mohammed. I'm a professor of sociology at Cal State Long Beach. I just want to thank also our panelists for joining us today. Our first panelist is Dr. Ahlam Mahtaseb, Professor of Media Studies. She is also the co-producer and co-director of the film today and co-chair of the CFA Palestine Arab Muslim Caucus. We are also joined by Dr. David Yacobian, Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History, both professors at Cal State University, San Bernardino. Our event is also co-hosted today by the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds. I would like to begin our event by first acknowledging the land that we're having this event on today. We want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional land of the indigenous people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well, to recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important Indigenous protocol that we are honoring by being here today. I would like to also discuss a little bit about who we are in terms of who's went into organizing the event today, and a little bit of background about our caucus. I'm the parliamentarian for our California Faculty Association's Palestine, Arab, and Muslim Caucus. And we are a statewide caucus that we go across the 23 campuses of the CSU system. Part of our mission here is as what we refer to as PAM, short for the Palestine Arab and Muslim Caucus, is that we provide a space to learn about, critically discuss, and really lead on questions or issues that concern Arabs, Muslims, and our Palestine within the academy. We also do this within our labor movement and as part of our broader peace and justice movements. We do this also while we collaborate too with other racial social justice movements and also support the social justice work needed that is central to the mission of CFA. Our members support and collaborate across the CSU with faculty, students, and staff who oftentimes are targeted or experience harassment or censorship based upon their research, our teaching, or even advocacy on justice for Muslims, Arabs, and around Palestine. We also provide a space for a dedicated space to educate and also act in coalition with other Council of Racial and Social Justice caucuses on these issues, particularly ones that have involved anything from Muslim bans on CSU faculty, students, and staff, violence associated with campus policing, or just even the need for curricular integrity and intellectual expertise in implementing what's now the CSU ethnic studies requirement. We also collaborate on intersectional and cross-caucus social justice work. So as such, I really want to welcome everybody here today. If you haven't heard of us before, to get involved. We welcome scholars, educators, and advocates who are committed to the co-liberation of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, and who do not exceptionalize colonialism, apartheid, and military oppression in Palestine or elsewhere. But we rather see it as part and parcel of the indivisibility of justice in our daily lives and also as members of the CSU system. So I'd like to hand it over to my colleague to then discuss a little bit of our organizing work with a statement that we've been working on as a caucus and was just approved by several other caucuses involved in the CFA statewide as well. Halam?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ali Mohammed. We issued a statement in support of Palestinians in Gaza and against genocide, the genocidal war that is being delivered with our tax money. And I dropped the statement in the chat. You can read it in full. We can't read it now, but it's basically has demands. And on top, of course, is an immediate ceasefire, an immediate blocking of military aid to Israel that rains, bombs on the heads of people in Gaza, and there are other demands, including demands for the CSU. As you mentioned, Dr. Ali Mohammed, this was adopted by the Council on Racial and Social Justice of the CFA, or the California Faculty Association, which is our official union for all faculty at California State University system. I just want to also point out remind everyone that we are going to start the film now, but I'm going to drop also a free online copy on YouTube if you prefer to watch it and then come back for the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We just have one last announcement before we get started with the film. So we'll be showing the film and then we'll have our last 30 minutes for a conversation with our panelists. But there's an important event that's coming up on Tuesday. This might be the first time that you're with us today. We've been doing a lot of programming just to kind of, raise our cross CSU-wide awareness on these issues. And so on Tuesday, we're going to be hosting, in conjunction with the Palestinian Feminist Collective, a teach-in. It will be from 12 to noon, from noon to 2. This is happening next week on Tuesday. So noon to 2, and you can register online, but we'll also circulate that flyer too as well. So I just wanted to make everyone aware and really welcome you and anyone's classes or other students that are involved and faculty to this event.
And I also dropped it in the chat.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so we'll get started with the film then.
There are no signs for them. You won't see them on tourist maps. But if you know where to look, if you remember where to look, you can find them, and hundreds like them across Israel.
كلها مهدمينها ورايحة. هذا بيتنا هون. هون بيتنا؟ هون. مش فاهم عليك. 100%. كيف؟ هون البيت.
To know the stories of these ruined towns and villages is to understand the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To learn their stories, you must go back to a year that none in the region will ever forget, though some have tried.
It's a black hole. I don't want to think about it.
The feeling of you have a state of your own, a Jewish state, no one have ever lived such a situation.
It's such a grave injustice, and that is really what hurts you. It's a grave injustice that has not been at all attended to and taken care of.
Only when I answered your question, I knew about it. Yes. I know that I don't want to think about the 48.
1948 war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only grown more complicated and intractable. And the hopes, fears, and grievances that drove the conflict in 1948 are still central to the conflict today. Israelis build more and more settlements in the occupied West Bank, and Palestinians continue to be cut off from their homes and livelihood by military occupation, home demolition, checkpoints, curfews, and the construction of a wall that runs deep into Palestinian territory. As a result, Israel now controls nearly all of historic Palestine.
Here's the question. Was the establishment of the State of Israel so important that no matter what price Palestinians had to pay for it, it was worth it? Or was there something fundamentally wrong with a project that can only be realized by displacing hundreds of thousands of people? If the establishment of the State of Israel was a historic wrong, then the question now arises, how does one redress this wrong?
Well, thank you so much for everybody staying around for our question and answer period. If you joined late, I just would like to introduce our panelists again. We have both professors from Cal State San Bernardino. We have first the co-chair of the PAM caucus, Dr. Alam Matsab, and we also have Dr. Yacobian with us today, professor of history. So if you could just put any questions that you have in the Q&A function, we'd like to take those for our panelists today. So I think while we're waiting for the questions coming in, I see a few. What I'd like to start with is just asking, you know, a little bit about the making of the film, a little bit about the inner workings of it. And so maybe just to give some context to that, I think that would be a great place to start.
Sorry, you would think we know how to unmute. Thank you very much. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the indigenous and ceded colonial lands of the Comiain First Nation in San Diego. The story started with my research. I wanted actually to conduct research when I was a junior scholar at Cal State San Bernardino on cognitive narratology and, you know, study Palestinian refugees, narratives of Nakba or Shatat or diaspora intergenerationally. And I wanted to use some of my filmmaking skills and do a short video, you know, like a classroom resource about, you know, how it is to live in refugee camps. So this is how I started. I started in 2006. I got grants. I bought filmmaking equipment and went first to Syria and then to Lebanon. And I worked for about a few weeks before, and this is 2006. So before Israel actually invaded Lebanon, and, you know, I managed to actually get out of the country just before it raised the airport. So I was stranded for 35 days and I couldn't finish my work. So I decided to go back in 2008. But in 2007, I met Andy Trimlett, my co-producer, co-director, and we both agreed to start working, but to center the year 1948, you know, a little bit before and a little bit after, as you saw. And at that time, Andy had a very compelling argument for why he wanted us to do that. He said that for himself, as an average American, he's white American who has nothing to do with the conflict. And although he had a degree in Middle Eastern studies, he could never understand really the so-called conflict until he studied the events of the year 1948, because then he realized, oh, so it is a systematic ethnic expulsion of Palestinians making way for a new state called Israel. And he said that most Americans watch the news or read about, you know, the history, but they wouldn't understand it until they really understand that kind of creation and destruction of the Palestinian society. So we started working together in 2008. We started filming in different countries, and it took us 10 years till we were able to release it when it premiered at the Arizona International Film Festival.
Thank you so much for that context. What powerful narratives from firsthand accounts, though, in the film itself. It's tremendous you were able to get so many people to speak on that as well. So we have our first question in, and I don't know which of you would rather start on this. The film is a powerful documentary. Themes of dispossession, occupation, Zionism, settler colonialism, and militarism, and the assault on Palestinian civilians. What lessons can we draw on from the history to apply to today's Israeli attacks on Gaza, the collective punishment and brutality of a modern state siege on Gaza?
Dr. Yaghoubian, why don't you start? And if there is anything I want to add, I'll take it.
Sure. I think that the important lessons that the film imparts are the historical lessons and narrative of the expulsion of the Palestinian people in 1948, and then subsequently the inability for them to return to their homeland. So this is the historical context that is completely lacking from virtually all mainstream media coverage of current events. The American media usually acts as though history begins on Monday, or in this case, history begins on October 7th without any historical context. And as Dr. Muhtaseb just explained, for individuals who don't have a connection to the conflict, who don't have any background in the history, it's very hard for them to understand. And when provided with narratives in which basically there is no historical context, it's understandable that many of them would just be shocked and horrified by this violence and not know how to react to a situation where they then see an armed, mechanized, nuclear armed state slaughtering civilians basically a daily basis since October 7th. So this film is critically important to provide the historical context so that we can understand the motivations for Palestinians since 1948 to continue this struggle to regain their homeland that was stolen from them. And so I think the film puts this into very powerful and stark relief, especially by way of the primary source interviews, such that this can't just be spun as someone's subsequent historical interpretation or revisionism. And so this is why I think we all should be so grateful to Dr. Muhtaseb and Andy Trimlett for having engaged in these interviews. Many of the research subjects have since passed away, and so it's absolutely critical that their oral testimony regarding the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948 was documented.
Yes, and I just want to add, thank you very much. That was actually very comprehensive and compelling. I just want to add that in the film, towards the maybe the third part of the film, there's an interview with Hava Keller, the older Jewish, Israeli lady, who talks first at the beginning of the film about, recognizing what she is involved in when she sees the shoes of the baby. But then, in the same breath, later she goes to the Naqab or Negev, where she actively participates in the ethnic expulsion of the people from that area into Gaza. And I think that sometimes it's a very quick, segment of the film And we released it when the Great Marches of Return started happening in 2018 at the borders of Gaza, because we wanted to explain Gaza in 1 minute. And I think that's very important. She says we put everyone on buses under gun, under the gun, and we send them to Gaza, and they are still in Gaza now. So people have to understand that the majority of the population in Gaza is a refugee population, and many of them came from just literally few kilometers or miles from where they live now in a total blockade in a small strip, which is the most densely populated region in the world, in a very small strip, coastal strip on the Mediterranean, surrounded by colonies, by Israeli colonies and Israeli bases, army bases. And they can literally see their lands from where they are, because that's where they originally were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and they still live as refugees in deprivation, in total siege, before October 7, before the Hamas attack, before anything else, 16 years of brutal siege. And that's just for Palestinians. That's why there's outrage at the way, the conflict is now being presented, because for Palestinians, it's a constant Nakba, as we call it. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. It's a constant genocide that is happening and extended, based on what happened in 1948.
Thank you so much for those insightful connections from the past to the present, particularly even just describing what Gaza, and I think just a fact that doesn't usually come up in conversation about being political refugees. I'm also wondering about, I was struck by he was an older gentleman that you had interviewed, and he's in the camp, right, the refugee camp, and he's showing us his stuff, right? I mean, I was glued during that and thinking about how much of his own family and generation, right? Like how many people, I think maybe part of it, and this could go to Orientalism, and also maybe even when I think about Indigenous people in the United States and Canada, this kind of disappearing effect that we think that maybe people have left, they've gone, they're no longer there. But to see him pulling his stuff out of the briefcase was really powerful. I'm wondering if you can speak to that in terms of our people's families, like is there's this lineage, and how have some stayed and some have left, right? And maybe just speak to that complicated history.
Yeah, so as we can, and please interrupt me and add anything you would like to, Dr. Yagobian. I'm going to say 2 points. And the first one is that, yes, many, as you saw in the film, about a little bit over half of the Palestinian population in 1948, and it was, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim were ethnically cleansed. And so over half of the population were forced out to neighboring countries. And Youssef al-Arwadi, you are talking about him, ended up in the Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon. We met many people in Shatila and in other refugee camps who, at that time, remember, we didn't have the internet and all accessibility when we were interviewing them. But there was a gentleman who actually, you see him talking about the Haifa refinery very briefly. He had the most compelling story I've ever heard, because up until that time, and I think it was close to 60 years when we interviewed him, I have to remember exactly, he didn't know where his sisters were, what happened to them. They were totally detached from each other, and there were no communications whatsoever between him and his sister. He heard few stories from some people who managed to disseminate messages through Jordan, then to Lebanon. I mean, because Israel and Lebanon are in a state of war, there are no communications were allowed at all. Now, of course, the internet breached all of that, but at that time, I asked him, because when I was doing field work and taking notes, I took a lot of notes for Andy, who was supposed to go and film in Palestine after I finish. And so I took a lot of notes, hoping he might be able to trace some of those stories. And I took down the names he just remembered the names of his sisters. So his mom divorced his father and married another man and had 2 children, 2 sisters. His father took him and the rest of the family to Lebanon. His mom stayed there. So his half-sister stayed, with their mom. He never knew how his mom died, what happened to her. He was totally in the dark. It was an amazing story. But so Andy managed to trace one of the sisters who lived in a small town. He knew, people told him that one lived in Haifa, and that was a big city. We couldn't go there. And one lived in a small town. That's where he was able to find the sister. And at that time, again, we didn't have the technologies we have, but I did a three-way connection. But you don't see this in the film because we had so many stories. We had to be selective. But we had him talk to his sister for the first time in, I think, close to 60 years at that time. And we filmed both ends of the phone call. So from the United States, I connected them, and there were teams on both sides filming them. And you would think, oh my God, like it's going to be very emotional, It was surprisingly detached because at the end of the day, they didn't know anything about each other. They were separated when they were very young. So, and there were many, many wrenching stories like these. Dr. Yagobian.
I would just say that viewers need to consider the fact that this one narrative needs to be multiplied by millions. There are millions of Palestinians who face the same loss of family, including, of course, the loss of everything they had. And to a certain extent, based on the country in which one lives, the sort of educational system and media system, complete lack of knowledge about their historical memory. And so, again, this is so critically important when let's say we have more popular interest in the immediate violence that might break out on a day like October 17th. This is critically important to remember that it's almost become cliche in some circles to say that there are Palestinians that still have the keys to their home. But indeed, those Palestinians who still have the keys to their home on October 6th in whatever refugee camp or foreign country they are living in maintain the memory of their life, of their country, and the struggle to regain it. So again, this is just that narrative is one of millions that could be cited, and hence helps to explain why this conflict is simply not going to go away by way of the purging of narrative in the memory of the Palestinian people and their struggle.
Thank you so much. We'll go to the next question by one of our audience members. I get lost with all of the different verbiage used regarding this conflict. Will someone please explain to me where the term Hamas comes from?
Do you want me to start? Okay, sure. So, of course, we focused on the year 1948 and what happened and the ethnic cleansing of not only the population, but also the destruction of over 500 Palestinian towns and villages. So as I said, where did they go? They go to different countries, and some of them remained in historical Palestine, but they were forced out into another land. And there, in the 1950s, another wave of what we call internally displaced Palestinians happened, where over 50,000 Palestinians were literally taken out, who remained in Israel, what became Israel, were taken out of their homes and lands and displaced also inside of Israel itself. So let's talk about Gaza. So now we have the West Bank, as the film showed, and Gaza. And there were several waves of and different types of resistance. So, we had nonviolence resistance and different waves of those, but also we have violent resistance or armed resistance, including the Palestinian Liberation Movement. After Israel occupied the West Bank, the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land, and the Gaza Strip, after years of oppression, actually, it was a very brutal military occupation in which I actually lived under before coming to the United States. Eventually, the Palestinian population inside of the West Bank and Gaza rose up in what is called the First Intifada, or uprising. And that was about 4 years of mainly nonviolent resistance. And during those times, the Hamas movement, was formed. during the first Intifada or uprising, which started at the end of the 1980s all the way to 1993, just before the signing of the Oslo Peace Agreement. So Hamas actually became a prominent faction in Palestinian resistance. And at that time, as I said, it was mainly nonviolent resistance because people didn't even have access to any weapons or anything like that. So, so that's its beginning. And then it existed both in the West Bank and Gaza, but then we had the Oslo peace agreement, where people had hope, actually, a lot of hope to maybe this is going to work. Unfortunately, it was the biggest blow to the Palestinians and the resistance. It only led to more land confiscation and theft. It led to more colonies. They are called Israeli settlements, but they are in reality colonies over stolen Palestinian lands, more oppression, more checkpoints, more apartheid roads, roads for Jews only. And I could go on and on down the list where, Palestinian lands were shrinking instead of actually, paving the road for an independent state as Oslo promised. So eventually Palestinians started reverting back to armed resistance because they saw that this was not going anywhere. But and this is when we had the second uprising or the second Intifada, which was more, on the side of, it included both nonviolent resistance and armed resistance. But things were boiling. This is when Arafat was killed by poisoning by Israel, the former head of the PLO and the former head of the Palestinian Authority. So now we have a Palestinian Authority, mainly in the West Bank, that has no authority whatsoever. It's called Palestinian Authority. And in Gaza, so in 2005, the Hamas movement, which is a political party, by the way. I know in this country there is no one's discussion of what is Hamas and what is Al-Qassam, but Hamas has an armed, part of it, or faction called Al-Qassam Brigades, or Azz-ad-Din al-Qassam in Arabic, and they are the ones actually who did the attacks in October on October 7th. But Hamas is a political party, and it decided to participate in the elections in 2005. Again, there was still hope that the elections might lead to the beginning of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, what is left of it, of course. And at that time, Hamas, went into the elections under the conditions of Oslo, knowing that, they had to go through those, conditions. They won the elections, and the elections were testified to be fair by even former President Carter of the United States. But the United States and Israel rejected the results of the elections and this is when they started planning for the siege. They started to have a coup against Hamas in Gaza, using the Palestinian Fatah movement. That didn't work. So they started the brutal siege after Israel pulled out of Gaza and started, created actually a buffer zone around Gaza called the Gaza envelope. This is where the attacks happen, where the military bases are and where colonies are. And 16 years of brutal siege, bombardment, 6 different wars. This is the 7th one, where generations of Gazans don't know anything except death, poverty, and a blockade, where it's considered the biggest open-air prison in the whole world. And I could go on and talk about before October 7th, as Dr. Yacobian mentioned, there was repression and it was boiling, and it was only inevitable that this, explosion in a repressed and oppressed, population happens. And I know it's easy here in the United States to put Hamas as a straw man because it becomes very easy. It really shuts down the conversation once you mention Hamas, because people freak out, because now we have a very specific narrative about Hamas and what it is, and you are not allowed to really try to explain what Hamas is in reality. So that misinformation suppresses the reality, really, of what happened. And I'll let Dr. Yacobian pick anything I left. Try to be
Thank you. No, that was really comprehensive. And I would just emphasize that it was through the prompting, the motivation of the United States and Israel that the elections took place, that Hamas becomes in 2006 the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank simply serves as essentially a proxy for Israel to maintain this ongoing peace, if you will, which isn't really a peace. It just buries the narrative, it buries the struggle, it buries the suffering, and the leadership of the Palestinian Authority essentially acquires its pay, its strength, its position from the Zionists. And so whether people like it or not, Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement based in Gaza, constitutes the legitimate government of Palestinians. And this is based, again, on an election that was prompted by the United States and Israel, and that Jimmy Carter and several other international organizations determined to have been valid. So again, whether people understand or like Hamas or not, whether they can only see its militant wing as representative of Hamas, the situation is much more complex. And again, historical context is necessary rather than sound bites, overgeneralization, stereotyping. I've heard people in mainstream media saying, all you need to know about Hamas is that it's ISIS. This is just flat out absurd. It's ignorant. It's not helpful. It doesn't help anyone to understand the conflict. It doesn't help us move any closer to a resolution, either in the short or the long term.
And may I just add quickly that Hamas is considered here as a terrorist organization, but most of the world doesn't consider Hamas a terrorist organization, including the European Union, including England, for example, the United Kingdom. So those are the United Kingdom considers the Qassam Brigades terrorist organization. And that's, of course, a whole conversation, whether they are or not. But at least, just know that in this country, you are not allowed to think beyond the mainstream narrative, and that's very dangerous.
Thank you so much for such an in-depth explanation. We have another question, I think, that actually goes really well with what you were just discussing about the American viewpoint versus the international community. This one is, it seems Americans are not well educated about the origins of the conflict. Can you speak to how Americans got information at the time of 1948 about what was happening? Was there a particular perspective given by our government or in the reporting at that time that has been passed on to future generations? Thank you for this important work.
I could just begin by saying, basically, if there was a narrative, it was the Exodus narrative, the flight of Jews from Europe as a result of the worst instance of anti-Semitism in history. That they came to a land without a people without land came to a land without a people and dropped the balloons. Israel is established in May of 1948 and is making the desert bloom. That essentially was the narrative, and Dr. Mutaseb can correct me if I'm wrong, but up until 1967, really, at which point, with direct U.S. involvement, much more direct support for the IDF by way of the American military-industrial complex, Israel also takes on this new character as a stalwart American ally in the Cold War, and if you will, unsinkable aircraft carrier in this Middle East, this crescent of crisis that needs a presence, either an American presence or a colonial presence to keep it in line. And so this was basically the narrative. Insofar as the mainstream media would focus on the region, it was only as a result of immediate crises. So it would have been, the June 67 war, the 1973 war, and then very highly publicized instances of either guerrilla activity, hostage taking. So this is largely how the American public learned about Palestinians. Palestinians were essentially, because of American mainstream media coverage, as well as is covered in Jack Shaheen's book and film Real Bad Arabs, Palestinians were basically associated with terrorism itself as an institution. And so unfortunately, this, by way of mainstream media, by way of Hollywood's continual vilification of Arabs, Muslims, and especially Palestinians, this is how Americans at best obtained a very vague and skewed understanding of the actual historical narrative.
Thank you. I just wanna say I wish we don't use IDF. It's a self-prescribed
IOF, I'll correct
or
myself.
Israeli army, because they refer to themselves as Israeli Defense Forces, and I push back because I don't see anything defensive. That's the narrative they created, and now, of course, it shows on our TV stations every night. Israel has the right to defend itself. When in reality, we're talking about the fourth mightiest, strongest army in the world, which uses Gaza as a testing lab for its weapons and surveillance technologies, and that's how it should be framed, in my view. If you want to be neutral, call it the Israeli army. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I know that we're running out of time, but I just wanted to end, if it's okay.
Yeah, I think we discussed this, and we don't mind staying if people would like to stay and answer the rest of the questions. I know we have at least 3 more.
Yes, that'd be great. So, but
I probably have to leave at 5:20, but.
Okay. Well, thank you for folks that are joining us. We understand if you have to leave to go to class, but for those of you who'd like to stay to hear the last few questions, we welcome you to stay. Thank you to the panelists too. So we have our next question, which indicates that this is a very powerful film. This film helps to humanize and visualize the historical context of Palestine and Palestinians in documentary form. Do you have any recommendations for historical fiction films that create this space by contemporary Palestinian directors?
I'll start, and I'm sure you will add a few, because I teach a class on settler colonialism and Palestinian cinema. So, and I actually am building a database for Palestinian films, because the good news is that we have a huge, rise in cinematic production among Palestinian directors. And I think that's very important if we really want to produce our own narratives, if we want to decolonize the narratives on Palestine. So I'm happy that we are now more active in the knowledge production arena, especially in cinematic production. And there are really many great filmmakers. I am proud to say that about half of Palestinian filmmakers are women. So for me, as a Palestinian woman, that makes a difference, because I think they touch on certain angles of stories that men might not, even consider. So we have a good balance, actually, of representation. May al-Masri is one of my favorite, but there are many others. And we have some Palestinian films that won the Oscars. If you look at Netflix now, for 2 years, has a collection of Palestinian films that you can watch. The latest one, and one of the best films, I think, is Farah Nabulsi's short film, The Present. She just finished a new feature-length film that is also cinematic, like fiction film, called The Teacher. I haven't seen it. I requested a copy, but it's still doing the film festival round. We have also Farha is a film that was released last year and created a lot of pushback, but you can see it on Netflix. There are great documentaries other than ours. I like to think of mine, ours, as a great film, but there are ones, especially on Gaza, like Born in Gaza is actually on Netflix. There is a great film by Abby Martin called Gaza Fights for Its Freedom. I think you can find it online. I could put some of these here, and you can email me if you want, a copy of my database. But May al-Masri did one of my favorite films, 3,000 Nights, which discusses the experiences of Palestinian female prisoners. And it's worth noting now that you hear about the hostages. Nobody talk about is the Israeli army taking hostages. About 4,200 Palestinians were taking hostages because the Israeli army incurs into Palestinian territories that are supposed to be under the Palestinian Authorities' control and kidnap Palestinians from their beds in the middle of the night, literally. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, this is well documented. The apartheid practices of Israel is well documented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, even the Israeli B'Tselem Human Rights Organization. And they talk extensively about the way they kidnap Palestinians, including children. Nobody ever cared about the fact that there were about 120 Palestinian children in Israeli prisons, some as young as 12 years old, who actually are under a different set of legal system. That's why they call it apartheid, because they apply two different legal systems, one for Palestinian Christians and Muslims, and one for Jewish Israelis. I mean, clear separation in applying human rights, clear separation in applying, the basic legal system, and I could go on and on. But 4,200 Palestinians, many women included. And I like May Masri's film because it actually talks about, in a cinematic style, the real story of one of those Palestinian female prisoners. And the list keeps going on and on, but we have one of the documentaries, Five Broken Cameras. It's a great documentary that won the Oscars, actually. That was in 2016, I think, 2015, 2016, and many more. Again, if you want more information, I would be more than happy to share with you. I'm going to drop my email in case you want to. And Dr. Yagobian, if I forget anything, please go ahead.
I don't have additional fiction film titles, but I would just emphasize Abby Martin's film Gaza Fights for Freedom is excellent, must see. Please do watch it if you have time, and it is available for free on YouTube.
Great, thank you for those recommendations and their accessibility, which I think is really important. And for those of us who are educators here, this is a great entryway into conversations at our own campuses, I think, as well. So we also have a question. In your opinion, what are some of the solutions to this conflict?
Do you want to start, since I started?
I will, and I'll also, there was another question which asked something similar. I'll just say that this question says, knowing a Zionist Israeli state is simply not sustainable, do you think that a lasting peace, justice, and return to Palestinian refugees to their historic homeland will come through diplomacy or through military conflict? And so just kind of to pair those two questions together, and without making this about me, I'll just say for a good 20 to 25 years, I was very much supportive of the idea of a two-state solution. Having seen international law essentially be ignored, United Nations Security Council resolutions, and the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people on a daily basis, even though that isn't covered in our mainstream media. Probably sometime around 5 years ago, I just made the realization that a two-state solution is simply not viable, and that a one-state, binational state in which Jews and Christians and Muslims and agnostics and atheists and human beings can live together is really the only viable option going forward. Regarding the issue of whether this can be done through diplomacy or through armed struggle and action, I would say, again, unfortunately, having seen the way that the United Nations Security Council operates in its configuration, that we've just seen once again that the United States can veto 14 other nations and simply proclaim what is going to happen, that I would say, unfortunately, armed struggle seems to be necessary either in the short or the long term to either motivate those in control of international law to apply it, or to simply change what the Israelis refer to as facts on the ground, if possible. And so, again, I'm not an advocate of violence in any way, shape, or form, but lacking the implementation of international law. I was born in March of 1967, so I have an easy time figuring out the years, 56 years since the 67 war, the occupation of the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, and Palestinians are still waiting for UN 242 to be implemented. So short of the world community getting together, reconfiguring the Security Council such that the will of the world community can actually be manifest, unfortunately, moving forward, I don't see any other option but the continuation of the Palestinian struggle in all of its manifestations, which seems to necessitate as well armed struggle.
If I may add, and I agree with everything you said, I think, yes, there's no one in the world, I think, still believes in a two-state solution, because there is no room whatsoever left for a Palestinian state. And I could bring up, we put the map in at the end of the film, if you remember, the map that showed the loss of Palestinian land since 1948 shows you that now we have only scattered, areas where Palestinians still live, and they are disconnected with or via a web of, they call them bypass roads, but they are apartheid roads for, as I said, Jewish settler use only, with the settlements. They call them settlements, I call them colonies, etc. So yes, one state solution is the only feasible solution, where, similar to South Africa, we could all live in one country where we have equal rights. It can't be Israel, definitely. It has to be a country that is, provides security and safety and fair rights and equality for everyone. I do believe that in this country, with our own tax money, we control this solution. Here's the key is here. The key is not, Israel could stop tomorrow if there is a will in the United States by United States government. And it's so sad to see President Biden taking this position and no one is challenging. I mean, not no one, because I see all these demonstrations around the country, and that actually makes me a little bit hopeful. People can't be fooled anymore. But unfortunately, President Biden is not listening, is not paying attention. Congress is so corrupted, except for the 10 Congress people who signed or voted no for full support for Israel, blind support for Israel, and except the 6 Congress people who voted present. I mean, better than voting yes. I'll take that. But except those, Congress is blindly also following the footsteps of the Biden administration. Now, just critical thinking, a little bit of critical thinking for Americans to know why. And you touched upon this, Dr. Yagobian, when you talked about the military-industrial complex. So Biden last week, the Biden administration announced that the $1 billion, now we're about to strike in the CSU system. We're about to strike because we are being told for 3 years now, there is no money to give us decent wages, decent living conditions, work conditions, and some of our rights. There is no money, there is no budget. But somehow our government is capable of coming up with $1 billion to support proxy wars in Ukraine and in Palestine. To support falling of bombs over our, the heads of Palestinians in Gaza. And you've seen that now we have over 7,000 dead. 7,000. The United Nations said the majority of them are women, children, and the elderly. I don't know the number of injured, but it's definitely over 15,000. They didn't spare hospitals, schools. They didn't spare anything in their shelling. Even the oldest Orthodox church in Gaza was totally destroyed and shelled, and many were killed who were actually sheltering there. I think at least 40, civilians were killed in the church when Israel bombarded it, and many mosques and UN, buildings. 26 United Nations workers were killed when they were, doing their work. Many doctors, many journalists, I think 26 journalists so far. Families of journalists, and it's a genocide. It's a genocidal war. Over 2,100 Palestinian children were killed so far with our money. And then the Biden administration last week announced that this is not a free giveaway, because this gives us the chance to replenish our military arsenal. That's exactly what they said, and create thousands of jobs. And I'm thinking and they reported on this in the news. I heard it on NPR. None of the journalists bothered to question that morally, ethically. We're creating jobs by throwing more bombs on the heads of civilians, by encouraging wars. And in reality, we're not making it better for Americans. We're making it better for the rich people at the top of the military-industrial complex. And I hope if anything you're going to take away today, anything at all, it would be this point. Who are we serving by promoting those wars? and funding them. Solution comes from here. If we stand up to the government and try to change it, I'm sure eventually we will have a solution. Eventually the Israelis will be willing to sit down at the table and negotiate. But if they are being told, oh, go ahead and do whatever you want. If the Biden administration says no to the ceasefire, why would our president refuse even ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, to get food, water, and electricity, food, water, and medical supplies into 2.3 million civilians? Like, why? Nobody not nobody, but nobody in the media, I would say, is challenging this. But I'm happy that the American people are. So Biden's, publicity is going downhill, and I'm so happy about this. I would never vote for a war criminal in my view. These are war crimes that are done in our name. And that should be stopped. There is a possible solution if we have the political will in this country. Sorry, I went on and on, but gets frustrating.
I think those are very important points, though, for those of us who are, at Turtle Island, right? This kind of, how do we deal with also our own complicity in war? And so thank you for bringing that connection to our audience. I think our last question from the audience today is, are there any maybe short films or short readings for high school students that you would recommend?
Go ahead. I have a video. I'm trying to bring it up. Do you want to take this? Do you have recommendations? For short films, I'm trying to bring up a great 4.5 minutes documentary, short documentary by AJ Plus. I'll find it now, about Gaza in particular and what is happening around Gaza. I found it very easy to understand with animation. I think for high school students, or for students in general, it could be a great resource. Dr. Yagobian, please go ahead.
I'll just say, unfortunately, my work relates to, in teaching, providing as much depth and primary source material, historical context. So in terms of something that's succinct or short, especially for like K through 12, I'm not the person to ask, unfortunately. But so thank you, Dr. Mutasib, for those suggestions, because I'm not really able to provide, I think.
Okay, so here's the video. And it doesn't have any graphic content, so it could be easier to use it in a class as a classroom resource. Also, the PAM caucus has a great list of resources that we have been working on in the last. We have been working on it for 2 weeks. I'm gonna find it. Actually, we are trying to upload it now to our website. Did you put the website, Dr. Ali Muhammad? Yes, if you put it there, you can find a lot of the resources that we have been working on, and some of these are suitable for students. For books, it's very hard to recommend books on genocide, right? So Ilan Papp's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, is probably one of the best in terms of explaining what the film explained. I think our film, 1948, Creation and Catastrophe, it's a little bit long, I understand. And we're trying to create 1 hour version, but we don't have time. But we avoided, except for 1 or 2 places, like graphic content. So the only one that would be maybe terribly graphic is the description of the Deir Yassin bakery story, which you could skip if you have to. And as I said, there is a good collection of Palestinian films on Netflix and online that one could use. Some of the great films also that talks about the culture is Stitching Palestine. It's a documentary about Palestinian embroidery. And geez, I'm going to put my email again. If you email me, I would be more than happy to share more resources with you. I think I'm getting close to picking up my son from basketball. So I have to go, but thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for joining us. We hope to see you at our future event. We'll send out a flyer about it, which is going to be next Tuesday from 12 to 2. We'll be co-hosting the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So hope to see you there. Have a great weekend. See you soon.
Thank you.